So it is a very great honor for me to be able to welcome you all and welcome Professor Quentin Skinner to this keynote lecture. I would just like to introduce Professor Skinner very, very briefly. This is information you probably already all know, and I will keep it short. Professor Skinner was a student at Cambridge University. Then in the 60s became part of the faculty there, and then in the 70s went on to work at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, to come back then to become a professor at Cambridge University in political science, and then to become the Regius Professor of History until 2008. Currently he is the professor at the University of London. But he did not only have a peerless academic career, he also wrote very, very influential works. He was a very, actually a young person. I think he was 29 when he wrote his famous essay, Meaning and Understanding in the History of Ideas. Went on to write very influential works on Hobbes and Machiavelli, republicanism, liberalism, freedom. Very important works. He's probably best known for his two-volume The Foundations of Modern Political Thought, and also his other great work, I think many people know, are his three-volume Visions of Politics. Collected many of his very important essays. And just recently, I think it was only 4 weeks ago, his latest book has been published by Cambridge University Press called Forensic Shakespeare. I think it was based on his Clarendon lectures in English. So I would like you, or I would like to ask you to help me welcome Professor Skinner today, and I'm looking forward to your lecture.
Thanks very much. Well, thank you very much, Timothy. Very kind words of introduction, and also many thanks to you for having invited me to the conference, which I've enormously enjoyed, and I've certainly learnt a great deal in these 2 days. May I also thank everyone, not just for coming, but also for allowing me to come here to the land of Goethe and talk to you in my own language. This is an extraordinary privilege, and it's one that Anglophones must never cease to register as well as marvel at. It makes us very lazy, but we're nonetheless very grateful. Well, we've been invited at this conference to reflect on the figure of the intellectual historian, but all I shall have to say in general terms about this figure is that I assume that he or she is someone principally interested in texts. That is, things like novels or plays, newspapers, court records, speeches, as texts. So that's all I shall say about subject matter. And what I'd principally like to try and do in these observations is to put forward and to illustrate. I shall work through two main illustrations, which I think is always the way to try to get a point across. Two main illustrations where I'm trying to say how it seems to me we should proceed. And both of these suggestions and illustrations I'm going to state negatively. That's to say, in the form of a critique of some prevailing philosophical assumptions and also some historical practices. Okay, here's the first. It's often said that the project of the intellectual historian is that of identifying and explaining beliefs. Now, that should be the enterprise of intellectual history is certainly in the Anglophone world what is currently simply assumed. So, for example, Marc Bevier, in a very influential book called The Logic of the History of Ideas, insists on what seems to me the very strong claim, I quote, that whenever people make an utterance, they express ideas or beliefs. and it is these beliefs that constitute the object studied by intellectual historians. Now, practicing intellectual historians generally show themselves content to endorse that kind of point of view. So, for example, to take an extremely distinguished Anglophone case, Keith Thomas, at the start of his masterpiece, Religion and the Decline of Magic, observes that what he is studying is systems of belief in the spirit of a cultural anthropologist. And while, as he puts it, many beliefs widely accepted in the past may now strike us as obviously false, the fact remains that in earlier times intelligent persons held them to be true, and the historian's task is to explain why that should be so. By the way, Keith Thomas there, as probably you know this great work, is talking specifically about witchcraft beliefs. And there's an unusually distinguished literature, both in German and in English, on that particular theme. So I've decided to take that as one of the examples that I shall work through in my remarks this evening. I'll come back to that, but for the moment I just want to put forward my first negative suggestion, which is that I do not myself think that we should take the project of the intellectual historian as that of identifying and explaining beliefs. I just don't think that that should be our focus. Well, why not? Well, one obvious reason is that much of the writing and speech encountered by intellectual historians is such that there's no reason whatsoever, parci bever, to suppose that any beliefs are being affirmed. I mean, that's surely true, for example, in the case where intellectual historians study literary texts. Admittedly, in the Anglophone tradition at the moment, there's a strong tendency to suppose that we can often identify authors with some or other of the expressed beliefs of their fictional characters. And an influential strand of recent Anglophone criticism, so-called new historicism, something like a systematic attempt is made by some new historicists to recover authorial beliefs, especially beliefs of Renaissance, early modern writers, from the evidence of the texts that they write, whether these texts themselves be plays or poems or later novels. But, I mean, to take an example which everyone will know, when, for instance, Shakespeare in Act 4 of The Merchant of Venice has Portia say that the quality of mercy is always greater than justice, that surely doesn't give us any grounds whatever for supposing that William Shakespeare believed that the quality of mercy is always greater than justice. He was writing a play. Do we have to say this? If you read the scene carefully, you will not only find that there's no reason to suppose that Shakespeare is affirming a belief, there's no reason to suppose that Portia is affirming a belief. Even the fictional character is not affirming a belief. But you might say, well, literary texts are a special case. What about the philosophical treatises on politics that I mentioned in my list? Surely we basically need to approach philosophical texts as statements of belief if we're going to interpret them. No, I don't think so. No, I think that that's also going to give you a very misleading and certainly a very impoverished hermeneutic. But obviously that is a more contentious claim. And so I want to try and illustrate this claim and defend it, to try to show you what I have in mind, because it's meant to be what the French would call un peu paradoxal. So let me give you an example, and I'm going to work through this for a few minutes. It's a familiar example from a celebrated political treatise, which also happens to have been much in the news of late because there's just been the celebration of its 500th birthday. I'm referring to Machiavelli's treatise Il Principe, and I now want to say a word about it. If you turn to, or if you remember, chapter 18 of the Principe, you will find Machiavelli arguing, in what is probably the best known observation in that well-known work, that political leaders who aspire to fame and glory must learn to imitate the leone e golpe e leone, the lion and the fox. Now, how is that passage best interpreted? The usual answer is that Machiavelli is claiming, that's to say, he's affirming the belief that success in politics depends on realistically recognizing the unavoidability of force and fraud. That unpacks the metaphor and states the belief. Now, I certainly don't want to deny that that appears to be what Machiavelli believed. What I want to ask is how adequately you can hope to interpret that passage if you approach it with that as your basic question in mind. Machiavelli's contention, after all, was not launched into a cultural void. It was part of an extensive Renaissance literature of advice books for rulers, in which everyone had agreed that glory is indeed the proper goal of princes, and that the means to acquire glory is to cultivate the quality which was called in Renaissance writings virtus in the Latin, or la virtu in the Italian. And by the use of that term, they sought to denote not merely the moral and political virtues, but also they took virtus, virtu, to be, obviously, the defining quality of the vir, the Latin for man. I mean, Latin, of course, less sexist language than English, has two words, does it not? Homo means man or woman, but vir means man by contrast with woman, the source of the English word virile. So they're thereby making it a defining characteristic of successful leaders that they should possess distinctively manly qualities. Machiavelli, by contrast, is telling you that if you want to achieve glory as a ruler, you will have to cultivate beastly qualities. So manly, beastly, that we're back in the metaphoricality of the passage. So he's thus opposing, in the passage I've quoted, the hitherto undoubted humanist piety that qualities of manliness form part of the key to political success. He's thereby questioning the adequacy of humanist accounts of virtue, and he's redefining what it means to speak of virtue as the name of the attribute that brings princely glory. Furthermore, he launched that critique into a culture in which, unquestionably, the most widely known and read treatise on political leadership was Cicero's De Officiis. And there Cicero had laid it down, I quote, I'm translating obviously, there are two ways in which injustice may be done, either by force or by fraud. Both methods are bestial and unworthy of mankind. Force because it belongs to the lion, and fraud because it belongs to the cunning fox. So Machiavelli, in the passage I cited, also turns out to be quoting Cicero, thereby reminding his readers of the most respected authority on the question of political virtue, while at the same time repudiating, and indeed you hear the tone now, ridiculing Cicero's moral earnestness. So my point here of the example is that Machiavelli, in the passage I've cited, is not merely stating an apparent belief, namely that force and fraud are indispensable to political success. He is also citing Cicero on the character of virtue, reminding his readers of Cicero's claim, questioning that claim, satirizing that claim, thereby opposing a standard tenet of humanist political theory, and at the same time offering an account of virtus, in which that central concept of classical moral philosophy is largely redefined. Well, you'd have to agree that that gives you a rather richer interpretation of this famous passage. But for me, what is crucial is that in approaching and interpreting the passage in this way, I have not been treating it as an expression of belief. Rather, I have been treating it as a quite complex intervention in a specific political debate and moral argument of the time. Now, of course, it's true that once you identify the character of the intervention, you may feel that it implies a number of beliefs on Machiavelli's part. For example, that Cicero was a silly old fool, which you didn't know, of course, when you first read that Yeah, anyway, you're beginning to get the point. But I'm not asking here what is Machiavelli affirming in this passage. I'm asking, what is he doing? And what's going on in this passage is my question. Or to use a kind of slang English idiom, what's he up to? What is really going on in this passage? Well, to generalize the point I'm there illustrating, what I'm proposing is that the vocabulary most appropriate to textual interpretation is the one that we use to speak about actions, not beliefs. So I'm proposing that for intellectual historians, the activity of interpretation should focus less on what people affirm and more on trying to recapture the underlying purposes of those affirmations. That's to say, thereby trying to elucidate what kind of a contribution they saw themselves as making to some pre-existing conversation or debate. Now, that is a polemical claim inasmuch as I wish to make it about all texts, however abstract in character. And when I say all texts, I also mean all texts in the extended sense in which a symphony would be a text that can be read, or a building, or indeed the most abstract works of political philosophy. I mean, let me give you an example which I've thought about a bit. Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, the most famous work of political philosophy of a completely architectonic kind in the English language. I like to think of it as a speech in Parliament. I mean, it would have been a long speech, admittedly. But what I'm trying to get at here is that's the character of the book that you have in your hand if you pick up Hobbes's Leviathan. It is a polemical intervention in the debate of the English Revolution in the immediate aftermath of the abolition of the institution of monarchy into the question, is political obligation due to a power that has come to authority by conquest? That's the question of the time. And he has a quite exceptional answer to that. The answer is yes. It takes him a long time to give that answer. But to understand the text, you've got to understand that that's what he's doing. He's trying to produce an irenic work in conditions of revolution. Or take another celebrated example, Plato's Republic, as an example of, well, what? I mean, once you ask my question, you'll see that you have very little chance of understanding Plato's Republic, because you've got very little chance of understanding the exact character of the contribution that he was making to the politics of Athens at the time, simply because we don't have the resources. We know he read Thucydides. We know he didn't like the sophists. But we can't go much further than that. There's something tremendously threadbare about the kind of context that interests an intellectual historian like myself. And I think that one consequence of what I'm trying to say is that very frequently you're going to find that there's much less prospect of understanding these texts than you thought if you treat them as forms of linguistic action instead of as affirmations of belief. So there's my first commitment, and I have to add that that has got me into a lot of trouble. I say in my Machiavelli example that I'm claiming to have identified the specific intervention that he was making in the writing of this particular genre of political theory. That's to say, handbooks for princes, of which the great example, handbooks for members of a ruling class, had been Cicero. And that one thing you have to understand about that text is that it's a satire, not in the sense that he doesn't believe it, it's a passionate book, but in the sense that there's much in that book of ridicule about it. To understand ridicule, you have to see the object of the ridicule, otherwise you've got no chance. So you have to move densely into the context of the Renaissance Mirror for Princes genre. If you emerge from that engagement, then a number of postmodern critics have asked me, not always very courteously, are you seriously telling us that you've succeeded in recovering Machiavelli's intentions? Yes, of course. That's the whole point. That's what I've done. But that is not just a polemical claim, that's liable to look a very old-fashioned claim. And it's not, but I need to say more about it by way of explanation, I think, and defense. The claim that this is a recovery of intentionality is only contentious if you believe, as a number of postmodernists so obviously do, that intentions are simply mental events. We talked about mental events when Timothy gave his brilliant paper yesterday. And motivations, which I'm not talking about for the moment, are plausibly mental events. The notion that an intention is exclusively a mental event is simply a philosophical error. But it is the error that leads postmodern criticism to suppose that you can't interrogate the living about their intentions, let alone the dead. But the intentions I am talking about are not mental events. They are entirely publicly inscribed. So, for example, Cicero says rulers must avoid force and fraud. Machiavelli says they must embrace force and fraud. And in doing so, he quotes Cicero's argument, he reminds his readers of it, he challenges the commitment, he repudiates it, he ridicules the earnestness involved, he presents a whole new picture of political virtue. Now, those are all the names of linguistic acts. Notice we only have one sentence in Machiavelli, but there have half a dozen or more linguistic acts that have been performed in the writing of that sentence. But those linguistic acts, if we've correctly identified them, are the names of the acts that Machiavelli intentionally performed. They are the names of the intentions with which he wrote. Their claims, that is, about the force of his utterance, that it has the force of being both a quotation and a response and a reminder and a challenge and a repudiation and an act of satire. All of those are accounts of what's going on in the passage, and so they're accounts of the force of the utterance, not the meaning, of course. And the explanatory hypothesis has to be that he spoke with that intended force, because that's the inference to the best explanation. But to arrive at that account of how you should understand that passage, and it is how I think you should understand that passage, there has been no attempt to get into Machiavelli's head or whatever nonsense people talk about this in order to come forth with those claims. All that's required is the public context of the utterance. If you get that right, you get the force of the utterance. The whole thing is dialogical, and the name of the game is intertextuality. Intertextuality gives you intentionality. That's really a way of summarizing my claim. But as you will know, more serious postmodern critics, whom we must greatly respect, have a further objection to raise. And typically they will want to say that this preoccupation with intentionality forgets the power of language itself in its state of continual and polysemic play, although play in Derrida, jeu, has been gravely mistranslated into English anyway, as if it's playing. Well, of course he means jeu in the mechanical sense that there's play in a machine. There's always some play. And that's going to, his point is, write itself over, there's his wonderful phrase, write itself over any intention to communicate, as a result of which you can't get rid of the ambiguities due to the polysemy that's involved. So, the objection goes, equating the meaning of texts with the intended meaning is just an obvious mistake. Well, that criticism has been levelled at me more times than I care to remember, but it completely misses the point. I don't know what it is that's wrong about my writing, but I don't seem to be able to get my thoughts across. I'm having another go this evening. But that completely misses the sense in which I'm interested in intentionality. It's true, and this is the way that Derrida and his followers are traditional hermeneuticists. They think that one should be interested in recovering meaning. And of course their point is that's what you think hermeneutics is, and we're here to tell you that you can't do it. But I never thought you could do it, and I'm not interested in doing it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something completely else. You could phrase what I'm talking about as a claim about meaning if you liked, because the English language is very poverty-stricken here compared with French. French has signification, but it also has vouloir dire. So I'm talking about vouloir dire. I'm talking about what people meant by what they said. So that's to talk about the intentions with which they spoke. It's not a talk about linguistic meaning, which is something completely separate from speech acts. Speech acts are what you're doing, meaning, if you're lucky, is what you have. But I'm completely willing to accept the deconstructionist argument about polysemy and ambiguity. Anyone who engages in textual interpretation would be insane not to agree with Derrida about that. And serious literary critics of very complex texts have never not known that. I mean, imagine being an interpreter of Cervantes and not knowing that there are certain ambiguities and maybe jokes and things that you better know about. I mean, it's quite primitive hermeneutics we're talking about, really. If you could imagine, there could be a strand of thought that made its living out of denying that. That's been known at an intuitive level by serious students of literary texts, always. But I can accept that point, which of course I do, because I'm making my central question one not about meaning, but about linguistic action. Now, nobody, I take it, supposes that you can understand an action without invoking the intentionality that's embodied in it, because in the explanation of actions, we identify the action as being an action of a certain kind, and this is how we individuate actions, in virtue of the intentionality embedded in it. If you give up that idea, you will find you've given up a lot. For example, you've given up the idea of criminal responsibility straight away. It would be strange to deny that actions are the actions that they are in virtue of the intentionality embedded in them. And that's all that I'm saying. And that's the claim about intentionality that I would want to defend. So there's the first part of what I want to say, and you will be delighted to learn that the second half is shorter. Let me round off the first part of these remarks by drawing out some implications to see, if we can, why what I've said might matter. And I want to draw out three implications. First, if there's always some intervention that any text, however abstract, may be said to be making in the culture in and for which it was originally written or spoken, then there's no categorical distinction to be drawn between literature or philosophy on the one hand and ideology on the other. It will always be worth asking, in other words, about the ideological orientation of even very abstract texts, as the Hobbes example was intended to illustrate. It's true, writers often put forward as straightforward affirmations of belief, statements which in addition have underlying ideological purposes, which are often of hidden and considerable complexity. And what I'm really suggesting is that if our the attainment that we wish to acquire in the end is understanding, then it's to those underlying purposes that you've got to try and attune yourself. And if you ask, well, how is that attuning to be done? I have a rather despairing piece of methodology. It's really my only methodological advice to offer you, which is that there is no substitute for omniscience. You've just got to know enough to know that Machiavelli was quoting Cicero. You've just got to know enough about what the contexts were. If you read enough, you get the answers. My second observation is that if you treat the texts that we study essentially as social actions, one effect, and this is beneficial in my view, and this goes with a kind of Foucauldian story about discours, and obviously Foucault, as you will already have gathered, is one of my heroes. So the beneficial result is that this decenters authorship. It doesn't, of course, abolish authorship. That was a provocation on Foucault's part. And people forget that he always distinguished the scriptible from the lisible. So not the sort we might be interested in. He would suppose, of course, have authors. But they're authors within a structure of discourse. They're contributors to traditions of debate. That was the point that he was making, and that's the point that I would also want to make. My third point is a cautionary one, and stems from the paper that Timothy gave yesterday, which is that the kind of explanation that I'm talking about here is clearly not a species of causal explanation. It solves puzzles by way of re-identifying speech acts. That's the solution. If the explanation is the solving of puzzles, which of course is the pragmatic account we would want to give of what an explanation is, then these are explanations, of course. They solve puzzles. You now know what's going on. But they do so in non-causal mechanisms. Now that's of course not to say, which was perhaps the mistake that a lot of Wittgensteinians made, that action explanation is incompatible with causal explanation. That's even arguably Wittgenstein's view. I certainly don't think any historian would want to take that view, because you may also want to inquire into the motivations that gave rise to the intentions that we're here isolating. I am here making strong distinction between motives and intention, and that's absolutely deliberate. I'm not talking about motivation, which is a very complex subject indeed, but about intentionality. But I'm very content to assume that the motive with which you act is the cause of the action that you perform. There's no problem about saying that. And indeed, I would not only want to say that, but furthermore, you might also want to ask about the causes of someone's having a certain motivational set, which will lead you out then into the wider fields, or I should say, the explanatory swamps of social history. Well, so far, this has been about a kind of challenge to the idea that the interpretative task is that of recovering and explaining beliefs. But obviously, I must not exaggerate. I'm not, of course, denying that one task of the intellectual historian is that of identifying and explaining beliefs. And so one large question, and this is the question I want to address in the second half of these remarks, is how should that enterprise be undertaken? If I now allow that, of course, that's part of the enterprise, so now I need to ask myself, well, how should that be done? Well, I want to proceed here, as in the first half of these remarks, by considering a widespread view. The right way to proceed, and this is a view that in the Anglophone writings of philosophy of history and writings of history is very widely agreed, is to begin by asking whether the beliefs you're trying to explain are true or false beliefs. Now that is almost a kind of standard approach in Anglophone analytical philosophy of social science, uniting such disparate philosophers as Charles Taylor, Philip Pettit, Stephen Lukes. Let me quote Philip Pettit. The reason why we need to begin with the question of truth and falsity is that false beliefs point to failures of reasoning. And that in turn means, I quote again, that we need to ask what kinds of social function or psychological pressure may have served in the given case to prevent people from recognizing the mistaken nature of their belief. So notice a very strongly causal account that we're being given there. That's fine by me, but so there's the claim. That false beliefs point to failures of reasoning, and there's a causal question to be asked about how you come to entertain the false belief. Once you've got that, you've got the explanation. Now, that view about how to proceed is very widely endorsed by practicing historians, by practicing intellectual historians. And I mentioned at the outset that a good way of illustrating this is through witchcraft beliefs. I'm very anxious not to take straw men, so I shall actually take a really great historian, namely Le Roi Ladurie, the classic discussion of peasant witchcraft beliefs in Les Paysans de Languedoc. Ladurie prefaces this wonderful analysis with the claim that it's possible to cause harm by casting spells. that belief, he wants us to understand, is false. Don't worry, I mean, it is, isn't it? And he's right to identify as false. And so what we're looking for, as Ladurie says, I'm translating Ladurie, is that this is the product of some deep and distracting form of psychological pressure that the historian needs to identify. Now, let's first ask, why do these philosophers, and why does a great historian like Ladurie think it important to begin by considering the truth or falsity of beliefs as a way into explaining them? Well, because of a strong distinction between reasons and causes. So, for example, Ladurie argues that to understand why witchcraft beliefs gain such wide acceptance in the France of the Reformation period, what you need to identify, I'm quoting again, is what could have caused such a breakdown in the normal processes of reasoning. I'm not so interested in the actual explanation that Ladurie goes on to give, but his, probably you know this, the main line of his explanation is to do with the effects of the Reformation in France, a time of breakdown of local consensus, especially Languedoc, which of course was becoming Protestant, a breakdown of trust between neighbours, a tendency to entertain new suspicions, new fears of your neighbours. So when something goes wrong, there's a heightened proneness to ask whether someone might have caused you harm, heightened proneness to accept the possibility that that could indeed be done. So notice that what Ladurie is doing there is, as you might put it, what the philosophers ask. He's begun by identifying the falsity of the belief, and he's given you a causal explanation of how that false belief came to be held. Well, that brings me to the second of my negative suggestions, which is don't ever write history like that. Don't even think of it. This is I'm lost for words. Why not? To ask the question, to proceed in this way, as the philosophers would have you proceed and as historians do proceed, is to assume that when an historian encounters a belief that he or she judges to be false, the explanatory task is that of looking for the cause of a lapse of reasoning. But that is to equate the holding of rational beliefs with the holding of the beliefs that the historian judges to be true. And that excludes the possibility that even in the case of a belief that nowadays might strike us as obviously false, there may have been good grounds in earlier historical periods for holding that false belief to be a true belief. So it seems to me, in other words, that the key explanatory distinction we need here is not between true and false beliefs, but between rational and irrational beliefs. When we seek to explain a belief that we think is irrational, of course, we're going to ask additional questions about how best to explain it. You're going to have to inquire into the sorts of conditions that may have prevented an agent from following accepted canons of evidence and argument, or maybe even supplied them with a motive for defying them. But it's always possible to follow the best available canons of argument in one's society in relation to the formation and the testing of beliefs, and nevertheless arrive at a false belief. So to equate the holding of a belief that seems to us false with a lapse from rationality is to foreclose, before you knew that you should have foreclosed, on a whole type of explanation. So to clarify that account, let me go back to Ladurie on witchcraft. He not only begins by noting that witchcraft beliefs were false, but of course he's assuming that these beliefs are not rationally held. They're beliefs which stem from very deep fears. That's why they come to be held. So his attempt at an explanation takes the form of an inquiry into the causes of a delusion. That's what he takes a historical task to be. But he's thereby left himself no space to consider a different type of explanation along the following lines: that the peasants may have believed in the existence of witches and therefore the power to cause harm as the result of holding a number of other beliefs from which that conclusion might reasonably have been inferred. So he's excluded in advance the possibility that belief in the power of witches to do you harm might be the product of a perfectly acceptable chain of reasoning. But that means that as a result, the explanation he puts forward for the delusion, you know, the story about the Reformation, for all he knows, that may be completely false. I mean, it's just invented history. And it also means that it's bypassed a number of questions which you might think it indispensable to inquire into about the rationality of the beliefs of the peasantry. Well, I'm sure you also know what I'm about to say next, which is that it's not, I mean, that's a classic text of La Durise, but it's not that that problem has not been identified. Some of the more recent literature on witchcraft has devoted itself to worrying about his lack of interest in the mental world of the peasantry. So, for example, another really extraordinarily fine work of scholarship on witchcraft, Stuart Clark's book called Thinking with Demons, makes it the basis of that book, methodologically speaking, that we should seek to make the people whose witchcraft beliefs we're examining as rational as possible. So I just want to comment on that historiographical development, because that doesn't please me either. I just wanted to offer two observations, and both of them are, I'm afraid, critical. One is, don't forget to distinguish epistemic from practical rationality. I mean, even great historians can look as if they've got into a muddle there. Consider, for example, Paul Verne's great book on whether the Greeks believed their myths. Verne's answer, as I'm sure you know, is roughly that the question as to whether it was rational for the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, to accept the truth of their myths was a question that was seldom pressed, but that it was not irrational for them not to press it. But what does he mean? Does he mean practically rational or epistemically rational? I mean, it may have been a rational policy not to press the question of truth, because the widespread acceptance of the myths had so many beneficial social effects. But if that is the argument, then it leaves completely open the question as to whether, if the Greeks did believe their myths, it was rational for them to hold that belief. Epistemically rational. I mean, it may have been practically rational. Was it epistemically rational? It's very hard to think that it was. So we really mustn't get those two confused. But that's not my main worry. My main worry about what's happened to this literature is that it seems to me that now we're taking too capacious a view about the rationality of historical agents. Stuart Clark, for example, argues that provided that we can show that the beliefs about witchcraft held by early modern demonologists cohered with their other beliefs, so that you got a coherent set of beliefs within which these witchcraft beliefs were nested, then that is sufficient for it to have been rational for them to hold the demonological beliefs that you've isolated. Now, I agree that if my beliefs are to be rationally held, it is necessary that I should be interested in consistency. I mean, if you're not interested in consistency, it's impossible for anybody else to recover your beliefs. If I affirm that I believe P and I affirm that I believe not P, you've no idea what I believe, and nor have I. But what I cannot see is how this can be a sufficient condition. It must also be a necessary condition that I should adopt my beliefs only in the light of a certain attitude towards the process of belief formation itself. That's to say, I can hardly be said to hold a belief rationally unless I'm interested in the sort of evidence that gives me grounds for concluding that my statements of belief can be justified and that they're not liable to be overturned by further evidence. So I just can't agree, in other words, with the suggestion that once you've uncovered the inner acceptability of a structure of beliefs, I mean, this view that became so fashionable in intellectual history and in cultural anthropology, that then you cannot fail to count as rational a belief that coheres within the system that you've uncovered. Now, that doubt about the procedures of current intellectual history and some current cultural anthropology is not very popular at the moment, because we're frequently told that to argue as I've just done is to import alien and condescending views about our superior rationality into studies of the past. That's a complete misunderstanding. If, as an historian, I stigmatize some particular belief I'm investigating as irrational, I need only be claiming that I've uncovered the prevailing norms for the acquisition, testing, and justification of beliefs in the community that I'm investigating, and that the belief in question was upheld in the face of, rather than in the light of, some agreed local norm. I'm not claiming that the belief was irrational according to my standards of rationality, still less according to the standards of rationality, whatever that could possibly mean. So there's my second negative claim. When intellectual historians seek to explain systems of thought prevailing in past societies, they should, I think, avoid asking questions about truth and falsity altogether. The only point at which they should invoke the concept of truth is in asking whether our forebears or some other society had sufficient grounds for holding to be true what they believed to be the truth, even if we don't agree that it is the truth. Okay, there's the second claim, and in a way that's the end of the story. Do I have 4 more minutes? That's really good, because here's the point. If that is the second claim, then, as you will all be aware, and I'm only too well aware, anyone who argues in the fashion that I've just now argued is liable to be denounced in some quarters, or of course commended in other quarters, as a conceptual relativist. So I want to end by saying a word about conceptual relativism in relation to the practice of intellectual history. There's obviously a sense in which my argument is relativist. I have relativized the notion of holding true a given belief. I have suggested that it may have been completely rational for a 16th century peasant in Languedoc to hold it true that you can cause harm by casting spells, even if I would not necessarily regard it as rational if you told me that that was one of your beliefs. Furthermore, I've argued that intellectual historians need to be relativists in that sense. You need to keep before you always the thought that you can hold a false belief with complete rationality. But it seems to me a misunderstanding to suppose that historians who espouse this position are embracing the thesis of conceptual relativism. Conceptual relativism, I take to be a thesis about the nature of truth. Roughly, it is the thesis that there is nothing more to truth than rational acceptability within a form of life. If you think, that is, that rational acceptability within a form of life, within a structure, a coherent structure of beliefs, is a sufficient condition, then you're a conceptual relativist. You're a relativist about truth if you think that's a sufficient condition of those beliefs being true. So, for example, Richard Rorty, in his great work, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, is definitely a conceptual relativist. When he discusses Galileo's dispute with Bellarmine, he insists that Bellarmine's rejection of heliocentrism, I quote, was no less objective than Galileo's affirmation of it, and that to suppose otherwise, wait for it, is merely to endorse the rhetoric of modern science. They're just two worlds. Now, I am not saying that at at all. I take it that in the given case there's a fact of the matter. So I actually believe that the Earth goes round the sun. And nor do I believe that it used not to. So I don't believe that it was true then and it's not true now, or any nonsense like that. I don't want to make any of these points about truth and falsity. I don't want you to ask if Bellarmine's beliefs about heliocentrism were true. I mean, actually they were false, but I mean, these are not the questions we should be asking as intellectual historians. So that being my position, I'm not even engaging with the thesis of conceptual relativism. I'm just saying that the question of what it may be rational to hold to be true may vary with the totality of your beliefs. I'm not putting forward what would be the wholly distinctive claim that truth can vary in the same way. And by the way, if you did put forward that claim, I think it would be self-refuting, because the proposition would present itself as true while affirming that there could be no such proposition. So I promised myself only 4 more minutes, and I've used up 3, so here comes the 4th. I haven't spoken here as a legislator. That is not a task in which I would feel comfortable. I haven't tried to say how we should write intellectual history. Obviously there are many valid ways of doing so. It is a house of many mansions, and we practice it in different ways. It's a large and it's an open field. However, it is a field that contains some large potholes. And I would like us to avoid these potholes. And what I've tried to do in this talk is to identify 2 of them and to show you, I hope, why it's best not to fall into them. Thanks very much. Thank you.